Hi everyone, we are starting with our first lecture of our conservation module today. This is the last module of your Concepts of Biology course. I'm going to start today by going through our lecture. It's a pretty short lecture. It's what we would have done in class if you were there to talk about your reflection questions and to have a discussion. And then I'm going to finish up by going over your innovation projects for this module. So here we go. So we have two learning objectives for today. The first is that we're going to talk a little bit about who actually assesses endangered species. And then we're going to talk about some of the traits that scientists actually use to assess the vulnerability of a species. So the group that ultimately determines the status of a species, they are called the IUCN, or the International Union of Conservation of Nature. So this is not a government organization. A lot of people think that this is something that's done by our government. This was a group that was first established in 1948, and it was the first group that was looking globally at endangered species as a problem. And they end up creating what they call the Red List of endangered species. These are our most vulnerable species that end up getting put on this list in hopes of being able to adjust something about their environment and to make them a little bit less vulnerable to extinction. So this little diagram down at the bottom gives a baseline of the kinds of species that this group looks at and how endangered they are. So right now there's more than 28,000 species threatened with extinction. And notice that it says that 27% of all assessed species. So that's a pretty big number there. And it breaks it down further. Of those 27%, 40% are amphibians, 25% are mammals. We have 37% being conifers, so not even an animal, they look at plants as well. 14% being birds, 30% are sharks and rays, 33% coral reefs, and then we have crustaceans. So all over the map, they're looking at all different kinds of animals. So when the IUCN looks at creating the Red List, these are the kinds of categories that they're looking at. Trying to just move this out of the way for you. There's no good place for it. What they do is they look at all these different variables about a species to determine how vulnerable they are. And then they put them in categories depending on that vulnerability. So down at the bottom, I'm not sure you can actually read that, but it says not evaluated. This is a really important category because there are a ton of species that the IUCN actually hasn't evaluated. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, we just haven't identified all the species that live on our planet. Some are incredibly rare, some are incredibly hard to find. Our deep sea organisms are very, very hard to keep track of. So you could have a species that's not evaluated at all. Next up, you could have a species that has been evaluated, but they've decided that they don't actually know enough to put them in any particular category. So data deficient and not evaluated are potentially some of the most dangerous categories that an animal could fall into because they could end up going extinct without anybody even looking. So after data deficient, the next step is least concern. So these are ones that have been assessed. They've decided they're fine, none of immediate concern. Next up is near threatened. So things are starting to get more serious. And then next up, you see in that red dotted box, those are our threatened categories. So once an animal falls within this group, we're in some trouble. So these are our vulnerable, are endangered, and are critically endangered animals. Up beyond that, we have extinct in the wild and extinct. So extinct in the wild means that the only specimens left of the species are found in zoos. And extinct means we haven't found any in a very long time. There are some cases where an animal that was extinct in the wild can actually be brought down some other categories and have their status improved. Doesn't want to click. There we go. Just time for you to absorb that whole diagram. All right, so the factors that the IUCN uses in order to evaluate how vulnerable a species is, these are called the animal's risk factors, and there's different types. You can have an extrinsic factor, and you can have an extrinsic factor. So our extrinsic factors are going to be external threats to biodiversity. So these are things that are happening within the animal's environment that ultimately end up being a detriment to their survival. And then there can be things about that animal's biology that lend itself towards being more vulnerable as a population as well. So we're going to talk about a few examples of each of these. So starting with extrinsic factors, these are external threats to a population here. One potential one is habitat fragmentation. So this is where an animal's habitat has been divided up and populations can no longer interact the way that they used to. And we end up doing this in a variety of ways. So just building a road could potentially cause habitat fragmentation. Building neighborhoods, putting up buildings, putting up fences, putting up walls. This would all be forms of habitat fragmentation. So this can disrupt migration patterns. This can disrupt mating behavior in animals if they can no longer reach each other. There could be resources that they can no longer reach as well. So this can end up having a really negative effect on our populations. Another threat is, of course, pollution. Pollution is going to be a huge issue, whether we're talking about pollutants in our air, pollutants in our water. Plastic pollution has become a really big deal lately for good reason. We have all kinds of bycatch fishing pollution where nets are left in water and animals end up getting trapped in them. This again could end up just simply killing an animal. They can eat things that they're not intended to eat. They can get chemicals in their system that they're not supposed to have. So again, an external threat there. Deforestation, we talked about this in our first module on climate change, that deforestation is a huge issue. It's a huge issue when we talk about carbon sinks and carbon emissions and balancing out that carbon in our atmosphere, but it's also a huge issue when we talk about animal habitats. So there are thousands of animals that live in forested areas that end up getting demolished, mostly for animal agriculture. Palm oil is another thing that ends up causing a lot of deforestation, particularly in Asia. So these are going to affect our Asian species, or like our Asian elephant. We have our orangutans, Sumatran rhinos, and our Bengal tigers. And our Sumatrans, these are all going to be negatively affected by the palm oil industry, which is taking out a lot of force in that particular area. And palm oil, if you guys don't know, it is in everything. Like, I imagine if you have a snack next to you right now, if you look at the ingredients, it probably has palm oil in it if it's processed at all. So it's everywhere, and it's another huge issue on top of animal agriculture. Poaching, big problem as well. We have a lot of these big animals in particular that are getting wiped out. Sometimes it's just for trinkets, sometimes it's for Eastern types of medicine that don't actually have much scientific backing to say that, say, an elephant or a rhino tusk has any medicinal purposes whatsoever. So this is obviously a huge external threat to biodiversity in certain species. So shifting to the intrinsic, so these are things about the animals themselves that tend to make them a little bit more vulnerable to extinction. The first one is body size. So larger, charismatic animals tend to be more prone to extinction. And part of this is because we see that happening, right? We keep pretty good track of our big furry animals. People think they're very cute. They want to know what's going on with the giant panda. They're willing to spend millions of dollars to save the giant panda there. But having a larger body size is also going to make you a little bit more vulnerable to these other extrinsic factors as well. So your habitat is likely to be larger if you're a bigger animal, so fragmentation is more likely to occur. You know, of course, pollution in any habitat is going to be an issue as well. And poaching is going to be more likely in these big animals too. So body size ends up being a factor here. The lifespan of an animal also is going to play a role. So our animals that tend to live a longer period of time are going to be more prone to extinction. And some of these intrinsic traits, they're all kind of wrapped up together. Most animals are going to have more than one of these kind of linked in with their biology. So usually animals with a really long lifespan, they don't reproduce until they're a little bit older. They might not reproduce quite as much either. So an example of this is this fish that you're looking at on the screen. This is an orange roughy. And the orange roughy was a really popular fish on menus for a while. And what people didn't know was that the fish that was on their plates was probably about 100 years old. These fish live a really, really long life, and they don't reproduce until late in life. They live in pretty deep, cold waters, and they swim in schools. And so the fishing industry did, not necessarily intentionally, but they almost decimated this population really quickly because they could just throw down a big trawl net and catch a huge school of these fish. And they didn't realize that all of these fish were like between 50 and 100 years old. And when you take out a population like that, then they're gone. So you're unlikely to see an orange roughy on a menu anymore because biologists have stepped in and intervened and said, can't do that to these fish. So in this case, the lifespan was definitely a detriment to this particular species being able to bounce back from a fishing industry blow. So wrapped up in that lifespan is fecundity. So how often and how much do these animals reproduce? So animals that tend to reproduce often and much, they are going to be a whole lot less vulnerable to extinction. Their populations are going to be able to bounce back a whole lot faster than are animals that only, say, give birth every few years and maybe only have like 2 to 3 offspring throughout their entire life. It's going to be just harder to repopulate a group when you're reproducing at a slower rate than if you're reproducing at a much faster rate. Your trophic level is going to end up playing a role here as well. This too, it tends to correlate with body size as well. Trophic level is where you fall within the food chain that you're a part of. And if you are towards the top of that food chain, you are going to be more likely to be affected by extinction than if you're at the lower one. Part of this is because of the idea of biomagnification and bioaccumulation. I think the most famous example of this is like mercury. And you might have heard that tuna contains a lot of mercury, and if you're pregnant, you should only eat small amounts of this because it can be a neurotoxin if you eat too much mercury. And the way that this ultimately works is that mercury gets in the water, and first your really little guys are going to get it in their systems. And then the animals that are a little bigger than the littlest guys are going to eat them, and they're going to get that mercury then in their system. Next one up will eat more of that middle group, and it ends up magnifying itself. And a lot of these toxins are stored in your fats. So it's not something that just leaves your body once it's entered your body. It actually gets stored up until you've hit a toxic level of it. So while just eating, say, one Arctic cod that has some mercury in it wouldn't affect this seal if he ate a bunch of them, and then all that blubber that he has had that mercury stored in it, and then a polar bear ate that seal, then you're going to start to see some really negative effects on that population. And where an animal naturally lives is, of course, going to play a pretty big role in assessing whether they're likely to go extinct as well. So what you have on the screen there is a Sifaka lemur. And lemurs are endemic to Madagascar. And that means that that is the only place in the world that they are found naturally. Fun fact, the second largest population of lemurs in the world is actually in Durham, North Carolina at Duke University's Lemur Center. If you are out that way ever, I'd highly recommend you check it out. It's a very, very, very cool program, and it's open to the public, and you can go and see all of their lemurs. But lemurs are actually the most endangered mammal in the world. And part of that is because they do have such a small habitat. They are only found on this one little island off the coast of Africa, and that is it. So when deforestation starts to hit Madagascar, that's going to really affect that population since it's the only one. There's no backup plan here for these guys. So all animals that end up being endemic or only found in really local places, they're going to have higher rates of extinction than ones that are found more worldwide. All right, so that brings us to the end of this lecture. I am going to escape out of this and then share with you our innovation projects. Let's try this one. Share screen. Share. All right. So in your Google Drive, you go over to conservation project, you will see this assignment. All right. So this one, again, it could be a little bit affected by being stuck at home, but I urge you to just do the very best that you can with this assignment. So in our climate change module, we talked a lot about diet being one of the biggest contributors to climate change. And at this point, you all have watched Cowspiracy, and you've gotten another big dose of how animal agriculture negatively affects our environment. So here is your task. For 2 weeks, you are going to keep a food journal. For the first week, you are going to eat as usual. And I want you to write down everything that you are eating. And then you are going to take this global footprint network calculator. And this is what this ends up looking like. So I already entered my email. There's one page before you get to this one. And what this website does, it asks you a lot of questions about your lifestyle. The first thing it asks you about is food, which is really fitting. When you do this, make sure that you go down here to add details to improve accuracy, because you can be more specific about what types of meat you're eating and how many servings of dairy you're eating daily. So you'll go ahead and you'll work through this. There's, it's about more than just food. And if you're not sure, go ahead and assume probably the worst of your living scenario, because that's likely true. Although now that you're living at home, you might have a little more accurate information than if you were living here on campus. So what you'll do is you'll keep moving through it. And at the end, it's going to tell you how many Earths you end up taking up. So I just clicked through. I didn't actually fill in any of my numbers here. But if I just click through with all the averages that they have, I take up 2.7 Earths. So you'll record that number. And then for your second week, what you're going to do is you're going to take the number of times that you ate meat and dairy in that first week, and I want you to cut it in half. So we're not going cold turkey. We're just saying cut it in half. Athletes, you don't have the excuse of my coach won't let me right now, which I've gotten in the past. So please take a solid swing at this. You're going to, again, write down everything that you have been eating. And you're going to take that global footprint calculation again, and you're going to see how that affects how many Earths you end up taking up. And then what I want you to do with this is ultimately create an infographic. There's all kinds of free software available on the internet. If you give it a Google, you'll get some sites that pop up. And if you're struggling, let me know, and I can point you in the right direction. But I want you to answer these questions in your infographic, in addition to including the numbers from your calculation. So how difficult it was for you, what would have made it easier, did it change your numbers, why or why not, what else could you do in addition to your diet, what advice you'd like to give someone who's trying to reduce meat and dairy. And then at the bottom, so this is going to be due May 3rd, you have your rubric to show you exactly how I'm going to be grading this assignment. So I figured, since we weren't able to be in the classroom together and talk about this as you all go, if you're sharing with me what you all are eating every day, I figured I'd go ahead and share with you what I'm eating every day as well. So I've started a Google Doc where I am writing down for you what I'm eating for 2 weeks. You might not have watched this. I'm recording this March 30th, so I'm going ahead and I'm just starting my food journal on March 30th. I'm doing this for 2 reasons. First of all, again, if you're doing it for me, I can do it for you. And secondly, I have been a vegetarian for about 20 years, and I have greatly reduced my dairy in this past year. I eat very, very little dairy. So a lot of people don't know what a diet like this would actually look like. And if it just looks like a bunch of salads, and no, that's not the case at all. I actually very rarely eat a salad. So I wanted to go ahead and share it with you so you could see what it is that I do on a daily basis. And I like teaching this module because it's something that is really dear to my heart. I try as an individual to really assess how I'm living and to try and make changes where I can to be more sustainable and to reduce my carbon footprint. I am not a perfect person. I am not a sustainable being. Like, my existence isn't sustainable, but I'm trying to do some stuff better. So eating this way is a really important part of my life. I feel like each time I have a meal and I don't eat meat and dairy, I am doing a little bit of something to live better. I have some other things that I do as well that I wanted to share with you, just so you know that I'm not just talking. I'm genuinely trying to live better. And I would be really happy if any of you all wanted to discuss some of these things. We could certainly arrange a little chat sometime, maybe as a group, whatever you all felt you wanted. But so I don't eat meat, very, very occasionally dairy. The only eggs that I eat come from my own hens. So I'm lucky enough to live on a little plot of land where I'm able to keep a flock of 5 hens. So I eat their eggs, but I won't eat eggs if I'm out and about at a restaurant. I've also taken up gardening and canning in the past few years. So my husband and I, we try to grow as much as we possibly can on our property. And that ends up reducing our carbon footprint because we're not relying on grocery stores, we're not relying on trucks, we're not relying on a bunch of refrigeration to get our food to us. We've certainly had some pretty big garden flops too. We're learning as we go, but we're definitely trying to do this. And I'm trying to preserve as much as I can as well by canning the food that we grow. I've also been trying really, really hard to reduce plastics. And this is a toughie because plastic is everywhere. It is just impossible to completely avoid. But there are things that you can do to be better about it. Part of it is just being really aware of all the plastics. So one thing that I do is I bring my own bags to the grocery store. And I know this is something you've heard a bajillion times, but I can't imagine the pounds of plastic that I have saved by bringing my own bags. Like, I used to just, at the end of a grocery shop, have this giant pile of plastic bags, and that has been completely knocked out just by bringing my own bags each week. I've also started making my own soap, which is a fun hobby to do. You end up then reducing all of that packaging that goes with soaps. I've started making like sweet teas and stuff at home and putting them in glass jars instead of buying jugs of that. Like paying attention to what your cat's litter comes in. I used to buy the big plastic tub of litter, and I've traded that in for one that comes in a paper bag. It's fine, it's just as good, but that's not a giant hunk of plastic that's around. And then the most simple things, right? Using reusable mugs and reusable cups. I just urge you to pay attention and think about what is around you. And if you can find an alternative, like if you're looking at the grocery store shelf and there's one in plastic and there's one in glass, choose the one in glass. That will decompose so much faster than the stuff in plastic will. I also have a little compost thing going on at my house. Sometimes I am better about it than other times, but just trying to reduce food waste is a big deal as well. And the last thing that I think really bears mentioning, and this is a hot button one, my husband and I have decided that we are not going to have biological children. This is not a choice for everyone. I completely understand that, but we've decided that if we are going to grow our family, it's going to be through adoption. There are over 300 kids in Catawba County alone that are in foster care right now. Kids end up being a huge part of your carbon footprint. I just heard these stats the other day. I'd never heard them before, but this was off of the podcast Ologies, which is super fun, that for each kid you have, to offset the carbon footprint of them, you would have to make 150 meat eaters go vegan. Another stat is that each kid is the same as taking 75 transatlantic round trip flights. So that's huge, right? It's huge. And we all know the human population is an issue that drives a lot of this talk about conservation and climate change. So I don't say that to say don't have kids. I do say it to say it's an option to not have kids. Just because your mom says you have to doesn't mean you actually have to. It's just something for you to keep in mind as you go through your adult life, that you get to choose what your life ultimately looks like. So again, I'm happy to have more conversations about any of these things. I'm going to continue to update this food journal. I can see I already need to go ahead and add and a handful of potato chips. That's not how you spell potatoes. Because I love potato chips. All right, so I look forward to seeing your food journals as you finish up with this innovation project, and I'm gonna go ahead and get our next lecture up on biodiversity. All right, take care.